Hello and welcome to the TiPH podcast, where we explore the world of public health, interviewing registrars, academics, and leaders in the profession. The aim of this podcast is to offer a wide panoramic of what specialty training can involve while providing some guidance and inspiration to those who are planning their next placement or who would like to train in public health. This is a special episode as I introduce and hand over to Kazim Beebeejaun and Josh Howkins, who will be taking over the podcast going forward. Would you both like to introduce yourselves?
Great, thanks, Dino. So I'm currently a ST3 registrar in public health in the East of England region. My background is primarily in infectious diseases epidemiology. I've trained in various roles across the UK HSA as well as WHO, and I also completed the field epidemiology training program back in 2019. So I think I discovered this podcast back in 2017 when people may remember SoundCloud was still a thing. But the podcast certainly helped me contextualize, I guess, the different experiences in public health and learn about the range of career paths in public health. So it's great to come full circle, and I'm certainly looking forward to being able to build on the hard work from yourself and Shamil.
Lovely, thanks. And hi, Dino, I'm Josh. I'm currently in ST2, so my second year of training in public health. I've just finished my Masters of Public Health at the University of Bristol, and I'm an academic trainee. I'm based primarily with the UK Health Security Agency. I come from a clinical medical background, so I've worked in a few different settings. I'm also very much looking forward to working on a podcast. Kazim and I have lots planned, some really interesting people agreeing to join us for future episodes. I also found previous episodes really helpful in helping me understand more about public health as I was coming into it or looking to come across to public health from clinical medicine. And I just hope we can add to that going forward.
And we're going forward now with you taking on the microphone now and leading this interview. Kazim.
So, Dino, the podcast took a little hiatus over the COVID-19 pandemic very naturally, and you have since completed your training on the public health specialty program. What role are you currently in, and where do you see yourself heading over the next few years? Do you have any specialist interests that you'd like to pursue?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, the pandemic made it impossible to run the podcast. And I'm really glad that now at the tail end of it, we are reviving it and opening a new season. So I'm currently a consultant public health in Gloucestershire County Council, and I lead on population health management and in general healthcare public health. So I work with the integrated care system, integrated care board, and the wider partnerships. This is my specialist interest. I joined public health with the idea of becoming healthcare public health consultant. And I really love what I do, and I love data, intelligence, and the integration of healthcare, social care, and the integration of wider determinants of health insights into the planning and monitoring and evaluation of our systems, our care systems. Where do I see myself in the next few years? Well, that is a little bit of a harder question in the sense that, as we know, ICSs have just come online, and public health, the role of public health, the location of public health in the system has historically been changing. So at the moment I'm in a local authority, but I would like to keep working on this subject. So it depends very much where public health sits. I am a little bit one of those people that thinks that for healthcare public health, the 2012 reforms represented a little bit of a complex step, because whilst we gained a lot by being in local authorities in terms of influencing in our relations with the public, with politicians, with place and local communities, we lost a little bit in terms of our ability to be in the, let's call it the room of the buttons, the room where decisions are made in terms of the NHS. So I think that potentially in the future, I would like to see myself a little bit more linked and belonging to that integrated care system, integrated care board, and have bring back public health within the NHS. I find that population health management is a term is fundamentally public health, so I find very much at home in that space. And it's a new term for a very old concept, which is evidence-based medicine, as let's say an alternative to eminence-based medicine that my colleagues know. I repeat quite a lot as an example. And so yes, I see myself in this path, and I would like to grow in this space in population health management.
Great, thanks, Dino, and glad to hear that you found that specialist space in the new era of ICBs.
Dina, you spent over a year running the podcast. Reflecting on your time, what aspects did you enjoy most, and what did you learn?
Well, to be honest, I was in Dudley when I met Shamil, and he was my buddy. So we had a buddy system in the West Midlands where I trained, and we became friends. And he, at a certain point, had to continue his training. He was doing an interdigitated training with general practice, so he didn't see like it would have been possible for him to maintain the level of continuity that the podcast required, and also wanted to have a next generation take it forward, because the podcast is not just an individual's project, but it's a project in itself in teaching and allowing others to participate in this activity. I to be honest, at the beginning I was a little bit, I would say, anxious, because I had never done anything like this. But I am a little bit of a techie. I like challenges in terms of setting up something technological. And so for me, the podcast has also been like a little bit of a dream. I had a lot of friends in university who used to run university radios, and I was trying to convince them that recording and putting online was better than having something live at times when people maybe weren't listening. And we had long debates about the potential of podcasts when podcasts were still very much a niche or a little bit of a techie hobby. And so I took it on with enthusiasm. What I discovered is that it's a great way to approach people that you wouldn't really otherwise have a chance to have a long conversation with, and have that conversation, have them speak and learn a little bit about their past, their story, their aspirations. And yeah, it's like, personally, selfishly, it's been a lot of short mentoring sessions, and then obviously opening also a lot of worlds that I hadn't imagined. So I had a lot of lovely interviews with people that took very, very varied career paths, and I wasn't expecting to have such an exposure to all of these things in my training. So I thought that was a real privilege, and I enjoyed also the feedback that people gave me at times when they liked an episode. And also it's great looking at statistics of the podcast. You can see that people are listening from all over the world. So there are people listening from the US, from Canada, from Hong Kong, and there are people that then also cite the podcast as a key influencer in the decision to pursue a career in public health. That is it makes it all worth.
That's great. And I think having that resource published online that myself and Kazim, you mentioned as well, can go back to and listen to if we're looking to get into public health or looking for something new. It's a really valuable thing to have.
Great, thanks, Dino. And so speaking of those stories you've been able to tell with the podcast, you've been able to interview some really interesting people. Are there any episodes that particularly stand out to you? Are there any particular favorites that you may have? I know it's a very hard question from running the podcast for such a long time, but are there any favorite episodes that stand out to you?
Well, as I said before we started recording, I think this question is very difficult. You're asking me to choose between my children, really, here. And I love them all equally, but they're all very different. So, and there is a little bit of a curve. My first episodes where I felt I listened to them again, and I feel like I'm very rigid and trying to maintain very much a coherence with how Shamil was maintaining the podcast. I wasn't really letting much of my personality come through. And then towards the end, I started interviewing a little bit more freely without just focusing on public health careers. And I must admit that probably the last episodes, the last few episodes, are the ones that I prefer. Also because I was just enjoyed them more. I was less focused on the actual technical act, and I started focusing more on the questions, on the meaning, and I was able also to listen a little bit more, because at the beginning I wasn't really listening to what people were saying. I was really focusing on making sure that everything was working. And so I listened to the interview most of the times afterwards when I was editing it, really. While towards the end, especially, yeah, the interviews that I did with some of my colleagues in the West Midlands around their political activity in parallel with training, or an interview that I'd done with a dear friend of mine who worked for MSF as an epidemiologist. All of those I did also on site. Those were episodes that I did in person, traveling with a microphone in my backpack to interview them in London or elsewhere where they worked. Those were the ones that I probably um, enjoyed the most, because they were proper, interviews. Well, yeah, we're doing it remotely now ourselves, and it's a great tool. But being face to face in a room with a person and having that setting up and pre interview moment is I think quite special. So I must admit I like those, and I learned a lot, because in reality you discover that in political convictions there's a lot of I would say family history and motivation in why you do politics, and when you do career choices like going to MSF and traveling the world again, it's got a big impact in who you are and how you lead your life, and you realize that public health is all of this. Is one of the most broad specialties that one can imagine. It's why I love this specialty, but it's also, especially although it's very broad, can be very deep. And so all of these specialties have so much, all these paths in the specialty have so much to tell us that I probably could explore only through a podcast, really, because I couldn't pursue all of these strands. I could just ask others what they encountered when they did it.
Great, thanks, Dino.
I think you might have touched on it a little bit there, some of the key experiences from running the podcast, meeting people, talking to people, getting a greater understanding, that listening that you mentioned. Are there any key things like that or otherwise that you've learned from running the podcast that you've been able to apply to professional life?
I think that the most important lesson I got from, not necessarily just from the podcast, I mean, it would be a truly amazing podcast if it was the only place where I got this message from, but the podcast reinforced this, is that in your career, it makes little sense, I think, to just scope the market and understand what's out there. In reality, the most important thing is to identify what is your passion and what you like doing. Because it's a funny thing, if you're passionate about something, you'll do it very well. And most of the people I interviewed were all passionate about their subject. They built their career that probably didn't exist before they did that step or started on their journey with an idea for a placement or for an application of their skills in a specific subject, in a specific area. So I think I discovered that. I think I saw a lot of passionate people that were doing very well their job and were public health consultants or public health specialists or public health academics in their own respective areas with authority and respected and successful because they were passionate. It wasn't many of the people I interviewed were doing things that were not really the core curriculum of public health, but they had invested the skills they gained from the training in an area where they thought it was meaningful and where they could find satisfaction and get up early in the morning and work hard until late and not feel like it was work. And that I thought was what I wanted to imitate and what I wanted to follow. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I think I'm also very much looking forward to meeting more people, exploring how they feel about the profession. I've only been a trainee it's my second year now. But the people that I meet completely agree the levels of passion. It's really good to see and very exciting. It makes you feel very lucky to be working or training in this profession. So very much looking forward to using this podcast as a way to meet more people, expand my horizons, and hopefully show people what we're seeing in professional life.
I couldn't agree more, Josh. But Dino, so speaking of, you mentioned the stories you've been able to tell with the podcast, and you've also mentioned the podcast as a sort of a resource for those working in public health that they can revisit over time. You've been able to cover a number of different themes on the podcast, including politics, as you mentioned, advocacy, and the role of the voluntary sector. Are there any emerging themes and priorities in public health that you would have liked to have explored but didn't get the chance?
Well, I would say that certainly a little bit of a regret, but I can justify why we didn't do it. I feel like we could have been active throughout the pandemic and done some episodes covering public health in the pandemic during the height of the COVID-19 emergency. The point is that, practically speaking, that wasn't really easy, both for where I was at the time. I was working for the mayor of London. I was at the GLA, and it was quite an intense period. It wasn't a time when I could devote a lot of my bandwidth to organizing interviews, and I felt maybe a little bit inappropriate at times because of the way that everybody was sort of hands on deck at the time. But yes, it would have been great to have had that opportunity of documenting live with a recurrent stream of podcast what was happening. But in reality, I think it can still be done. So I think it's up to you now, maybe to build a little bit of an historical memory. It's still very fresh in everyone's mind, and I don't think the COVID-19 pandemic is even over yet. If we see what's happening in China just these days, I think that there's still plenty to happen, and plenty to talk about, and plenty to explore. The big inquiry, the national inquiry, just getting started. So there is plenty of things to sink your teeth into, I think. Personally, another one of the things that I think I could have explored more was I had a few interviews slated for that period when I moved to London. And one that I really would like to still do, and I probably might come back to do it myself, is the interview that I wanted to do with Ed Jessup, who is the person that for so many years organized the training days for preparing Part A, the professional exam that we have all to pass. And I've always found him a really inspiring figure, how he organized this course relentlessly year after year. And he became a bit of an institution. And I promised him I would interview him, and then the events and me moving to London, a lot of us, we were basically always in the opposite place. He was in Birmingham, I was in London, and vice versa, and we never managed to make it happen. So if he's listening, I will probably send him an email and try to reorganize that interview that it's been missing from the calendar for so long.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dino. It was on the COVID point. I think that's certainly something we will explore on the podcast. It does feel like public health is in a bit of a reflective period, being through the worst phases, I guess, of the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, it's certainly something that we will be covering in future episodes.
Great. I look forward to listen to them.
It'll be good to have you back as well. It sounds like a good episode. It will be a good episode, I'm sure. I know the course helped a lot of people get through a very tough exam.
Yeah, it's a real shame a real shame is normal, I guess, but he had to stop doing it. And I think those of the new generation that once attended with Ed in person are probably missing out. So yeah, it'd be great if we had recorded a few of his lessons. It would have been great to share them.
You mentioned the pandemic and just focusing back on your training in public health through a pandemic. The training always takes a few years, of course, but through that time, it must have felt like a lifetime. How different do you feel now compared to when you started training? Was there a point during that where you felt comfortable to transition to your consultant role?
Well, yeah, it didn't really feel like a lifetime, to be honest. I think it flew because I never felt that the training was the only time when I was studying public health. I realized that I love public health because even when I was working as a doctor in a hospital, I was always looking at public health aspects of what I was doing. I was looking at the organizational, the data, the integration of digital tools. I was looking at how the different training paths of different professionals were intertwined or separated. I was looking at how professionals collaborated well or not. So in reality, I formally joined the training at a certain point, but I felt that I was always looking at these aspects. Even back in Italy, where I trained medical school, I did a lot of political activity within the student representatives, and even nationally looking at quotas for specialty training access. I just realized that I've come full circle. We are now back to a point where the NHS is looking at these aspects as crucial to maintaining a healthcare system working. So I think that, yeah, I don't feel very much different. I feel that I've covered some ground and I got to where I wanted to be. And in terms of when I felt comfortable, when I first felt comfortable to be a consultant, I think that probably that happened in reality before I became formally a consultant. It was during the pandemic, both in London and in Birmingham, in my last two placements, where I was asked to act up to a consultant level, that I started finding a little bit my own voice. And due to the fact that we were all so stretched and there was a need for rapid decisions and that concept of whole hands on deck, I got a little bit of space to actually experiment with my own individual decision making with a little bit more responsibility. And I don't think I probably felt comfortable immediately, but I started to transition to consultant role at that stage. And I think I would really recommend everybody does that at the end of their training, either after they actually qualified or and they're looking for a job, or when they have an opportunity with a certain placement towards their ST4, ST5, because it's a moment where you're still safety netted in a sense. You have a senior consultant or director of public health there to help you, but not that you won't have it later, but you're still a trainee effectively, but you can experiment a little bit with the role and explore what that means in practical terms before you apply for a job where you don't want to discover that role and that job doesn't really fit your inclinations or your attitudes or your skills. So I think it's a good moment. So yeah, that's when I started feeling comfortable being a consultant, and I think helped a lot to apply for jobs as well.
That's great. We're very lucky, I think, coming into it to get those rotations into really quite vastly different areas of public health in all its way. And going forward, I know we're going to be looking at getting registrars, current registrars, or people who have done interesting placements coming through, hopefully to showcase a few of those, which would be great. Kazim as well, just Dina mentioned about recruitment. I think particularly to public health, but you might have been to every aspect of medicine. But recruitment to public health and diversity, I know you've been involved recently on the report about diversity recruitment into the public health training scheme. And just thinking about future episodes, I'm sure it'll be something we cover, won't it?
Definitely, it's something that's come out recently, looking at the diversity of the public health specialty program, and essentially finding that there are certain groups and in particular ethnicities that are less likely to be successfully appointed to the training program. So it's certainly a theme that we will explore over the podcast, as well as the sort of broader topic of what does a well-equipped public health workforce look like, in order to meet the public health challenges over the next 20 years or so. So yeah, completely agree. It's something that we will explore in future episodes.
That sounds like an interesting episode I want to listen to. I like it when the podcast becomes something that I will have to put on my own alerts and push notifications, because that feels like properly handed over.
Yeah, thanks, Dino. Just a bit on your point about when you felt comfortable to that transition to a consultant role. When it came to sort of developing your leadership skills over your training, did you feel that was the period towards the end of your training that you felt like you really developed your leadership style and skills and that kind of thing, or do you think it was something that you slowly developed over the training program?
You see, with leadership style, for me, I think it's a question of where you're working. I don't think there is one leadership style that works everywhere and in every role. So it depends very much on the situation, your team, what you want to achieve, who are your partners. So I think that the best leadership style is an adaptive one, and one that can be humble when needed, and can be authoritative and proper leading when instead appropriate. So I think I experimented with different leadership styles in different situations, and I'm glad that I did, because that gives you that flexibility that is needed, I think, to be a proper leader in a system where, let's be honest, nobody understands everything and nobody's competent in everything. You have to trust a wide team that may well be much larger than your own organization. It might go beyond the walls of your institution or your system even, and you have to trust people that, especially during the pandemic, are behind a camera, or not even behind a camera, just a voice. And I think that was the biggest lesson. I mean, it is that building trust and being respected, but also respecting others, so that it's reciprocal. I think it was the way that I developed my leadership style, and the pandemic was an accelerator for a lot of us, because we were all pushed into roles that would have probably been years in the making for peacetime, let's say. While the COVID pandemic accelerated really the growing up of a whole generation of public health consultants. So it was a really sad and traumatic time, but also a very important time, and very powerful for many.
Great, thanks, Dino. And we do actually have a future episode with the president of the Association of Directors of Public Health talking about that exact point you made about introspective and adaptive leadership. So yeah, look out for that episode.
Yeah, thank you. Lovely. So, do you know a new tradition we would like to end episodes with is to ask our guests for one career tip to those pursuing a career in public health. So, is there one thing that you wish you would have known as a new trainee looking back?
As I said, this is something that no educational supervisor, I'm one now officially, but no educational supervisor should tell you. But I think it's important to know, and it's something that other registrars told me when I was at the beginning of public health training, that the point is, in public health training, compared to a lot of other medical specialties where things might be a little bit more rigid, and you might get literally deployed to certain places, in public health is a bit different. And I think it's one of the main attraction of the specialty for those that suffer a little bit from the militaristic organization of other paths, of training paths. It's that in public health you should never take no for an answer. So if you have a good idea for a placement, if you have a passion, if you want to go somewhere and do something with someone in a university or in an institution, international organization, or even with a company, or with a group of innovators or local leaders, you can do it, as long as you make a very good, compelling case for that being important for your training or meaningful for public health. You will get yes eventually, because our curriculum is very broad, very open, very flexible, and the training itself is different. So we are a resource for the system, but we are not service resources. So we are a little bit supernumerary, and we can also contribute to an external perspective to organizations which are a lot more static in terms of team composition than the hospital teams that other medical specialties have, where the name of the game is flux, and everybody changes every 6 months at most. So I think my advice is really, do not take no for an answer, and chase those opportunities while you're training, because you may not get this opportunity again, because then life catches on and you get into more rigid pathways with actually proper jobs and contracts. and you regret maybe looking back not having taken that leap of faith into left field placement or something a little bit more important, like a national treasure, or taking those 6 months a year abroad to do some international public health. So they're all opportunities, and they're all possible as long as, again, it's built around a good, compelling case for why you want to do that and why you need it and why your training will benefit and why eventually your training will benefit the community that you return to.
It's good advice. I'm inspired. So thank you. Kazim, have you got any more questions?
No, just thanks for joining us, Dino, and yeah, thanks for trusting us with the podcast, and I hope me and Joss are able to do it justice.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm always here if you need me for advice. I'm always here. Me and Shamil are always available, and I'm sure that the podcast can only grow with the energy and passion of a new generation of registrars. Thank you.
Thank you, and Shamil, thank you as well. And yeah, really looking forward to taking this forward. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.